Welcome to the BreakPoint Podcast. I'm Shane Morris, and if you've ever started a project facing high expectations, you know how unsettling it can be. I think the worst for me has probably been parenting my 3 kids. No matter how well you do, you always feel like you've somehow messed up or fallen short. But then there are the jobs where the expectations are just sky high, where the standards are, if anything, humanly impossible to meet. My guest today had the guts to accept exactly such a job. Jonathan Roumie, an actor known for shows like Chicago Med, also plays the role of Jesus in the recent VidAngel series, The Chosen, directed by Dallas Jenkins. If you're a BreakPoint listener, you've heard us talking about this series lately after the first season was released for free via app this year. Aside from being the biggest crowdfunded media project in history, the series has distinguished itself as a uniquely human, down-to-earth take on the lives of the disciples, but especially on Christ himself. And so much of that is due, I think, to the talent of this one man. Welcome him now to the BreakPoint Podcast. Jonathan Roumie, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Shane, for having me. Delighted to be here.
Now, I didn't ask before we started. Roumie is how you pronounce your last name, right?
Yeah, Roumie is exactly right.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Terrific. Well, I'm almost finished with season 1 here. I just watched The Wedding at Cana, and I'm really surprised at how different this series feels, but especially your portrayal of Jesus. I like the way John Stonestreet put it on BreakPoint. He said that this Jesus doesn't give airy pronouncements and stare off into the kind of middle distance frame. He has a sense of humor, and he's even got wit. He sweats. He gets cut in one scene. He looks right at people when he talks to them and kind of feels their emotions. What was your thinking going into this? Did you kind of improvise your way into this Jesus? How did you come up with such a unique take?
Well, Dallas Jenkins, the creator of the show, and I have been working together. We've been friends and working together for 6 years now. I started working with him 6 years ago on a short film that he did for his church's Easter service. And that was the first time I played Christ for him. And then after we did that film, there were a couple of more projects, vignettes that he filmed for subsequent services over the next 3 years. And so we really started to develop a shorthand for creating this version of Christ that was relatable, that focused on his humanity as opposed to strictly his divinity. And so a lot of it was based on, this stuff in between the Gospels that he would write. There was a couple of scenes in one of the last short films or vignettes that we did where they're like 2 of the disciples, I think it's Andrew and like Thaddeus are arm wrestling or something like that one night. And I think Andrew loses, I can't remember who loses. And I think another disciple says, I can't believe Andrew lost to Thaddeus. And Jesus says, yeah, even I didn't see that coming, So it started to play with like this, very gently play with the humor that like he can sort of, not make fun of himself, but like start to explore like Jesus's, humanity as being somebody who clearly has gifts, who is the Son of God, but he's living as a human amongst all these friends, these people that he meets. And how do you humanize God? How do you make him accessible and relatable? And humor has become one of the ways that we can do that. And, also just in between the scenes, just relating to people, like in the way that we're human, in the way that we, sweat and bleed and cry and laugh and all of the things that make us human, Christ experienced, except sin, obviously. So the Gospels don't necessarily tell us about all those human things because that wasn't the intent. The intent was to really show Christ as human in certain regards, but mostly to establish the fact that this is God come down in human form. And I think, most of the Gospel writers' audiences were, meant to understand that this man is the Son of God. And that was the focus. So, in between the pages of the Gospel, what did his life look like? And that's kind of what The Chosen attempts to explore as reverently and biblically and humanly as possible.
Well, and that is one of your goals, right, is to do it reverently and in a way that's not sort of informed by the typical desires that animate a Hollywood production. And I know that's why Dallas chose initially to crowdfund it so that you guys could have that kind of freedom. Is that right?
Yes. Making a project like this, especially when you're dealing with faith, it's not something that most people are used to seeing done well. and done right. There have been very few examples in history. Mel Gibson's The Passion was the most successful independent film in history, and it happens to be a film about Christ, but it was independently. He funded it himself. You take, like a miniseries, one of the biggest influences on me growing up in this realm was the miniseries Jesus of Nazareth from 1977. In between then, there have been a series of projects that I sort of hit the mark in places, but mostly miss in other places. So it's been very hard to find, the balance in existing in history. So I think Dallas was essentially, committed to creating something that he hadn't seen before, that he wanted to see. And when you're dealing with, I think, the subject matter, it's not, people aren't just running up to you and throwing money at you. So, he tells a story where his expectations were if he was lucky, he would raise $800. And then when VidAngel said, no, we think we could crowdfund this, and then it ends up raising $11 million from over 19,000 investors all over the world. It just sort of blew everybody's mind. And yeah, I remember watching, once we had been greenlit to go, we started funding the first 4 episodes. That took a few months. And then once the first 4 were done, and then we started showing trailers of the first 4, like the back 4 episodes were funded like 2-3 times. I don't know what the numbers were, but it seemed like it was exponentially faster once people saw, wait a second, this might actually be good. I want to get in on this. And so it took maybe, I think, a month or something, 6 weeks to fund episodes, 5 through 8. So it was pretty incredible to watch it come together.
Well, and if anything, that kind of adds to the pressure, right? You've now gone from an expectation of a few $100s to 11 million. You're thinking, all of a sudden, well, we got to do a really bang up job with this, right?
Well, I think the good thing is that when we had raised the first 4 million, we greenlit the first 4 episodes. And then, once you start getting the first few episodes done, you establish the rhythm, you kind of get the senses how the project is going. And even being on set from day one, you kind of already really get this intuition that there's something different about this project. There's something really special about this project. And so I don't think any of us had any fears once we got on set. When we read the scripts, we were like, if this turns out half as good as the scripts are, we'll be okay, And I think it just with many of us feel that, myself, I can only speak for myself, and I know for Dallas as well, he's been very vocal about this, but like the Holy Spirit has been present in this project from the beginning to, now. And I feel continues to be, even as it's spreading across the globe. So it has taken what was on the page to what was shot, and then has given it a whole other dimension and made it better than any of us as people could attempt to make it.
Jonathan, you're a believer yourself, I understand. Those of us who are listening on the podcast can't see the icons behind you here, but it's evident that your heart is in this in a way that an actor's heart wouldn't be if he didn't actually embrace the material personally. How does that inform your portrayal of Jesus?
I was baptized as a baby and grew up in the faith. I'm a practicing Catholic. I started out as Greek Orthodox. My family is from the Middle East and from Europe. So we've had a number of influences, and it's been a seamless transition to go from one to the other, because Greek Orthodox and Roman Catholicism are very similar. I think that has also set me up for ecumenism in my own heart, and my desire to see a unity in the Christian faith, and I host a prayer hour every day at 3:00 on my Instagram live page, where basically I just offer people the opportunity to pray with me some prayers that I know. And it's given me such a sense of peace, especially during the pandemic, and the opportunity for people to just disconnect from all the noise and the news and all the stuff that induces fear. So for me, it's been something that, while my faith has been with me all my life through playing Christ, and especially with this project and getting to don his sandals, so to speak, for an entire season and spend so much time with him, it's given me a deeper desire to get to know him further. And just before we started filming, actually, like probably about 3 to 4 months before, I had my own kind of deeper conversion as a Christian. And it involved, just completely surrendering my life and my will to God's will. And that, I think, was sort of the setup to be able to walk into this project, to walk onto this set and know that, this isn't about me. This is about telling God's story and bringing it to the masses, and hopefully at some point a majorly crossover audience, going from the believers and the faith-based to being appealing to the secular, and getting folks to ask questions and piquing people's interests in, the greatest story ever told, and a story that I think the culture effectually at large tends to try to shut down and shut out of, especially on the media side. So thank you for what you're doing in offering an alternative to, what the media is typically putting out as far as how the culture goes.
Well, absolutely. One of the features of The Chosen that I really resonated with is the way it seeks to tell compelling and very human backstories for Jesus' first followers, while also remaining faithful to the big touchstones of the biblical text, getting back to home base every few minutes. I noticed that during the climactic moments of each episode in particular, the ratio of biblical dialogue to fictional dialogue, it radically goes up. It's like every other line is from scripture. Do you find it challenging to kind of make that transition between the apocryphal stuff that Dallas has sort of dreamed up to make a compelling story, and how do you guys avoid the pitfall of just becoming an audio Bible in those moments?
Well, I think that's a great question. Thank you. I think I don't find the transition difficult because the writing is just so good. And there are many, many translations of the Bible. I've probably got 4 or 5 of them at home myself. And I love just hearing, it's like anything translated into a different language is going to depend on the translator. Some translators are more poetic. Others are a little more literal to the original text. So I think what Dallas and Ryan and Tyler, who write the show, are so brilliant at doing is being able to blend the translations of the Bible that they're using with the vernacular that the cast members and the characters are speaking, so that you don't notice this harsh, like they don't all of a sudden drop in to King James,
these
from
and thous,
like talking,
right.
Talking streets of, yo man, listen, but thy will, you're like, whoa, wait a minute, what's going on? They don't do that. So everything is pretty conversational and accessible as far as the translations of the Gospels and the scriptures that they're using.
I did notice there was only one section, I think, where these and thous were used, and that's where Jesus is sitting down with the children out in the wilderness, and he's teaching them the Lord's Prayer. He's almost like giving them a sneak peek before the disciples get it, and he goes, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, and they're repeating after him. But that's it. Otherwise, it's
that's the one. Yeah, that's the one place I think you're right, and I think it's interesting because when you read, in the Gospels themselves, it's not as fleshed out as the prayer as we know it. It's much more condensed. Occasionally I'll recite a version of the Our Father that a priest friend taught me in reconstructed first century Aramaic. And it's based on, the translations of the Gospels, and not so much the prayer as it's derived as we've known, which again, I think sounds like a King James version, which is, just become the standard. I think it's interesting with prayers, because if you start changing up well-known prayers, there was probably, and I never talked to Dallas about that, but there was probably a very specific decision to use the standard version of the prayer versus something that might have been closer to what he would have actually said.
I hope you're enjoying my interview with actor Jonathan Roumie, who plays Jesus in The Chosen. I want to remind you that registration is open for our upcoming virtual event, Truth, Love, Together. We have an absolutely outstanding lineup of Christian worldview thinkers like Os Guinness, Johnny Erickson Tata, Sean McDowell, Dr. John Lennox, and many, many more. We'll also be presenting our annual William Wilberforce Award to a truly heroic man, Pastor Bob Fu, fondly known as the pastor of China's Underground Railroad and founder of China Aid. And folks, this event is absolutely free. It's ideal for families, small groups, and of course, for individuals. All you have to do is come to wilberforceweekend.org. That's wilberforceweekend.org. My guest today is Jonathan Roumie, who plays Jesus in The Chosen, the miniseries that's just finished up its first season on VidAngel and is well in production for the second season, I believe, about the life of the disciples as they join in Jesus' story. You're listening to the BreakPoint Podcast. Jonathan, another thing I love about the series is how, as we reach the climactic moment of each episode, there's all this payoff, if you will, where the fictional lead up and all the moments that we've watched in the lives of the characters thus far, they go naturally into the reports we have from Scripture of events that happen. And then the dialogue makes sense. And every little word is just like boom, 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 And I think my favorite example is probably the call of Simon Peter, where, he comes in from this night of fishing. We've met him as this person who's become an informer on fellow Jews because he's in financial trouble and he has to, get out of debt with the Romans and the tax collectors. So he's a man in desperation, and he spent the night out there casting net after net after net, and he's just got nothing left. He comes in, he thinks he's about to be arrested, and Jesus says, well, cast one more. Just go back out a little ways and cast one more. And I love how it almost appears he's in the shallows there in the most pointless, idiotic place to try to fish. But he says, okay, you know what? I'll humor you. I'll cast one more. And he does it. And of course, we all know the rest of the story. I love that seamless transition there and the payoff. Are you guys consciously trying to do that, trying to bring new life into the moments we're so familiar with in Scripture?
Yeah, I think, there's so much to what you just said there that I had all these, behind the scenes moments kind of flashing into my brain as you were describing that. So, there's so little in some of the pages of the Gospels where there's so little to kind of go off of. For instance, when Simon is fishing all night and he catches nothing, and then he goes out again at the behest of Christ. And, it's like, well, what would make a guy that's fishing all night want to just do that one more time? And then what would make him, after he has this miraculous catch, how could he just completely turn his life around? So what they did was, they tried to deconstruct from that moment going backwards. It's like, how do we build up to this point where he has no choice but to follow Christ? Because this is such a momentous occasion in his life. This is such a huge turn of events in his life that, of course, he's going to go follow him now. Because if we didn't have any understanding or an idea, and of course, all of this is just supposed. We don't know for sure that, that he had any issues with taxes, but we knew that people were heavily taxed at that time. We knew what their concerns, what their issues, what their troubles, what the oppression was about during Jesus's time. So based on all of that, what could have been the most compelling way that for a man like Simon, who was kind of surly and rough and tumble and a fisherman and, a guy that basically carries a knife, what would get, something like him to completely turn to follow a rabbi, when he was a fisherman, because fishermen normally just don't go following rabbis. First of all, to be chosen by a rabbi, that's mind blowing in and of itself. For a fisherman to be it's usually they're looking for more educated people that want to be rabbis, not fishermen. So I think Dallas and his team, they're asking the questions, how does this happen? How does a person have this conversion of heart in this way? And just finding the most plausible, biblically suggested ways to be able to do this. And I think that's why when we actually have the miracles happen in the Gospels, it's because we spent so much time building something that's believable, that we can all relate to as viewers. We can relate to owing taxes. We can relate to, oppression in our own lives in certain ways. We can relate to loneliness and confusion and stuff. So yeah, they're literally mining the human heart and applying it to these stories where they just weren't written out for us. We don't get all those details. So.
We don't get the biographical details, as C.S. Lewis said,
No,
of any of
that's
these
right.
people.
That's
The
correct.
cool part is that something like this happened. Not this, probably not this exact scenario, but these people really did have backstories. They really did have motivations. They did have motivations for, making reasons for making the decisions that they made, even when they seemed like flash and irrational decisions, like dropping your nets and following this rabbi. You see that as well in the scene where Mary Magdalene is healed of her demonic possession, which is something that's only alluded to in the Gospels, but now we see it portrayed, where she's constantly trying to repeat this passage from Isaiah, I believe. It says that, I have called you by name.
Right.
And then the first thing Jesus does is he calls her by name, and her name is virtually forgotten. She's known by a different name at this point as a prostitute and this demonically possessed woman. And then he just repeats the passage to her, and she knows. And there's this massive payoff now to the story that's been building up till that moment.
Mm-hmm.
I think watching these scenes changed the way I thought about these characters, because I was reminded in a very poignant way that they do have backstories that were not necessarily told, because we don't really need to know the backstories. Did it change the way you think about these characters, and especially Jesus himself?
I think it just made them relatable. And I know it's also been, I just want to make one kind of clarification, that it's been assumed as much, and because of her situation as Lilith, it's appeared that we're portraying Mary as a prostitute, but we're actually not. But you're not the first person to kind of see that. I think what happens is that in whatever her 7 demons that were possessing her, the assumption is that there were some bad choices made. So I just wanted to clarify that, because I know Dallas has been protective of that idea of not trying to portray her as a prostitute, but for whatever the backstory that we've invented as her deep, deep wounds that led to possession, it could have spawned her. The situation where Nicodemus finds her could have been spawned by an element that is relating to that, but she wasn't technically that. So even in that clarification in how that portrayal is, like, I'd never thought about, like, what were the demons of possession that Mary Magdalene had? Like, because there's all kinds of demons. Humans, we suffer from all kinds of, attacks from everywhere. Like, could it have been, some sort of sexual oppression kind of thing and manifesting itself? And like, how would that have played out? Like, would she have blacked out? Would she have literally become another person in those, kinds of scenarios? And how frightening must that have been for her? I had never thought about her life up until prior to the point of Jesus healing her ever, really, because we'd never seen it. We only have ever met her on film and in these stories at that point where she's following Jesus and everything is cool and she's on the team. You know what I mean? But how did she get to the team? How did the coach pick her? Like, why did he pick her? So yeah, it's changed how I view many of these characters. Peter is a character that I've seen a little bit of the backstory for. And like, for instance, Jesus of Nazareth, kind of, you get a little bit of his fisherman's life in that depiction, but not much. Nothing like what we're doing. What The Chosen is doing, and Dallas and his team are writing, has never been done before, which is what's so exciting and refreshing about it. And just I think the reason why people have responded to it, because it's new, but it's relatable, and it's not deviating from the stories we know. It's just adding backstory to the gospel stories we know and love.
Jonathan, how do you feel about the inevitable fact that people are going to, kind of envision your face when they're praying or when they're doing their devotions or something? That's something that Jim Caviezel with The Passion of the Christ had to deal with, and everyone who's ever portrayed Jesus, I think, in a beloved film adaptation or television adaptation. How do you work through that?
There's not much I can do to kind of get my face out of people's minds at some point. It's funny, last year, toward the end of the year, I think after all of season 1 was released around Thanksgiving, my sister called me. She's like, okay, listen, this has got to stop. I was praying the other night and then your face popped into my head. And like, that's not really what I was planning when you told me you were going to be playing Jesus. And I said, listen, okay, don't look at a painting. Just use a painting. Do what I do. So for me, obviously, I don't think of myself, but I've had that as well. And, I try to refer to paintings that aren't of specific people that I know to kind of put a face on Christ myself, because it's more tangible to me as like that could be a depiction of Christ, because I don't know that that's, Robert Powell or that's Jim Caviezel. And so it's kind of interesting, like seeing there's been a lot of fan art. The fans have been amazing for this show. They've been so loving and supportive, and so many of them have joined me in prayer and so dedicated, and fan art has been phenomenal. And, I just say, it's what I signed up for. So I'm prepared to however God wants to lead me and use me to bring people closer to his son. If it happens to be that my image connects them, or this depiction in this show connects them, which is a lot of the feedback we've been getting, like people's relationships to Christ have been either established or restored or refreshed or revitalized in some way. That to me has become my mission, part of my mission on this earth, why I'm doing this, why I'm here doing this role and not somebody else for this particular project in this time and place. To me, it's become clear that it's been part of my mission as an artist.
And I have to say, if you happen to replace any pictures of Obi-Wan Kenobi on little grandma's mantelpiece, it'll be okay. That's an improvement.
Yeah, I think it was a couple of days after May 4th, but I, for the heck of it, there was one or two images from, you haven't gotten there yet, I think, in episode 7, where I literally look like a Jedi.
Oh, nice.
So I posted a picture on my Instagram page that basically says, Jesus, the original Jedi Master, So yeah, I'm happy if it's not Obi-Wan on little granny's mantelpieces.
In a sense, I think the average Christian, to get serious here for a second, what you were talking about earlier really struck me, especially evangelicals. I think we're more prone to over-deify Jesus, if I can put it that way, than we are to over-humanize him. We sort of imagine him almost detached, almost like a Gnostic Jesus. Not intentionally, but an unintentionally Gnostic Jesus, where he's just floating through his world and not really paying full attention to his...
On a cloud.
Yeah, because he's so caught up in the world of being God. Why do you think it's so important that we remember and portray Jesus like he's portrayed in The Chosen, that Jesus is really God become actually man in the incarnation?
Because he was human, because that's how we relate to him. That's how we know that he understands our sufferings and our trials and our struggles. And that why, when we are having a difficult time in life, that we need to turn to him and not turn away from him. I think that's why it's so important to remember. Because if we didn't have an example of a God that knows what it's like to be human, well then, when things get tough for us, it's like, what's our response? Well, you don't know what it's like to be human, God. And he's like, yeah, you're right, But in this case, we don't have that excuse. He's like, no, I do, actually. I've been there. And this is when, and this is how, and this is what I did for you guys. So now you must do this for each other. So if I was willing to go to the cross for you and be scourged and beaten and crucified, you can forgive that $50 your neighbor owes you. Just let it go, Right. That thing that somebody said that they said in the heat of an argument, you can let it go and just be like, forget it, We have an opportunity to truly walk the walk and be the best versions of ourselves possible because of the example that Christ gave us. And so for me, it's a daily struggle. It's a daily struggle to kind of just walk upright, and live by his example. But when it's tough, I know that, he made the ultimate sacrifice for us. So all I got to do is just turn over my troubles to him and surrender, and he makes it all easier.
What are you most excited about as the series continues?
Getting back to work. I think, specifically narratively, I'm looking, I don't know if it's how or when or if, but I'm really looking forward to this story with Lazarus, John 11, 20, something like that. Yeah, pretty much John chapter 11 is about Lazarus, and just hoping to get to explore the friendship where, it's one of the only times, and Jesus wept. We're like, wow, when you have a line like, and Jesus wept, Lazarus must have meant something to him. This guy must have meant something. So there's so many relationships that we're building with the disciples, and there's such talented actors to work with. So as the troupe fills out, it's going to be really interesting to kind of see where the stories go. And yeah, I think hopefully being able to tell these stories for a long time, for the next several years to come, that is all of our hope.
Amen. My guest today has been Jonathan Roumie, who plays Jesus in the VidAngel series The Chosen, directed by Dallas Jenkins, which is right now in production for Season 2. You can watch all of Season 1 for free right now by downloading the app for The Chosen. Just come to breakpoint.org and we'll tell you how you can get that. Jonathan, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today on the podcast. It's been just a great conversation. Thanks, everyone, for listening to the BreakPoint Podcast. And remember, come to wilberforceweekend.org to register for next month's Truth, Love, Together virtual event to hear our outstanding lineup of Christian worldview thinkers. It's completely free and promises to be one of the great worldview gatherings of the year. Again, that's wilberforceweekend.org. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.